As 2022 comes to an end, as I'm speaking with you on New Year's Eve 2022, the question is, who is winning the war in Ukraine? Is it Russia? Is it the West? Is it Ukraine? And what will be the long-term implications for the emerging world order for all our lives as this war grinds on? Well, the first thing to understand, of course, is there's not just one war in Ukraine, not just one war that's been fought on the battlefields in Donbass. It is a multi-dimensional war, a full-spectrum war, not only between Russia and Ukraine, but between NATO, Russia and Ukraine, and the four vectors of that war. That's what I'll be looking at in this video, in this podcast. Welcome everyone, I'm Jeff Rich, and this is the Burning Archive podcast and YouTube channel, and this is the second segment of my retrospective review at the end of 2022 of the Russia-NATO-Ukraine war. In part one, I explain the relevance of this black legend of Russian history to the events of the Russia-Ukraine war, how it contributed to the distorted images of Russia and Russian history that are portrayed in the black legend of the Russian history, which I've explained in a series of videos on the channel and on the podcast. How that distorted image is one of the causes of the Russia-Ukraine war, that it has led to a failure to negotiate a genuine peace between Russia and the parties of the West in the wake of the end of the Cold War. But now the task is before the entire world to find a new set of international and security arrangements that will offer lasting peace. Do we choose the route of the liberal American rules-based order, or do we choose the path of a multipolar world advocated by the majority of the remainder of the world? That is the question we'll be looking at in this podcast. If this is the first time you've come to the channel, do subscribe and like, and share the podcast. Leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. And I'm Jeff Rich. I'm a historian, writer, podcaster, and a retired government official, and I've been following the Russia-Ukraine war closely throughout 2022 and have done a series of podcasts around both the Russia-Ukraine war between February and June 2022, and also a whole series of podcasts on the black legend of Russian history, telling the story of Russian history backwards, which has also been a way of trying to make sense of what some of the key issues are, coming to a better understanding of Russia so that we can negotiate a genuine peace in the world that accepts the valid claims of different countries around the world for security, peace, and a fair world order. And in this video, I'm going to look at four vectors of the Russia-Ukraine-NATO war, and those vectors reflect the early analysis I undertook on the podcast, the Burning Archive podcast, back in February and March 2022, where I commented that this war was not just a war about military matters. This was a war that was being conducted on multiple fronts. Most dramatically so, I guess, in the extraordinary economic war that was being launched against Russia. The American President Joe Biden announced the intention of turning the ruble into rubble, and there was a serious attempt, I guess, to engineer an economic collapse in Russia, similar to what occurred perhaps in the 1990s and in I think 2007 or 2000 or in sometime in the 2000s there was also a serious run on the Russian ruble. So there was an attempt to weaken Russia's military effort by sabotaging its economy through the imposition of sanctions. And then similarly, there was an enormous information and cultural war, an unprecedented, perhaps, information and cultural war launched against Russia. Russia was to be cancelled. All sorts of Russian news and media outlets in the West were, remarkably for the democratic West, banned. You could not watch Russia Today on YouTube. There were even calls for people to prevent access to Russian websites in the West as well. Hardly free and open information for all citizens. And similarly, Tchaikovsky was cancelled, Dostoevsky was cancelled, so on and so forth. It was an astonishing and really quite shocking set of events. And also there was a major diplomatic war. It's perhaps a bit of an oxymoron to talk about a diplomatic war, but there was certainly a diplomatic struggle, a conflict going on to sort of win the hearts and minds of different countries and the loyalty of different countries in votes in the United Nations, to a serious attempt to isolate Russia diplomatically. And in my episodes, my very first episodes of the podcast that looked at the Russia-Ukraine war back in February and March 2022, I set out an analysis of this war along these sort of four vectors. And recently I just actually listened back to some of these things, and I think some of that analysis is quite, I think valid. Some of it was perhaps wrong. Certainly I think on the military front, at that early stage in late February, March, I overestimated the, with the initial rapid advances and surrounding of Kiev, I thought that the war would be over far, far sooner than in fact it was. But certainly at that point, I was already picking up both the shock at the cultural war against Russia, the resistance of major countries like India to the diplomatic war against Russia, and also the apparent resilience of the Russian economy against the economic sanctions. And you can check out those retrospective podcasts on both my YouTube channel and on the podcast as well. I think they sort of hold up, but what I want to do in this video is really go for each of those four vectors and look at, well, who's winning the war now? What are the implications for the emerging world order? And also, I guess, how have we seen the black legend of Russian history, which I've talked about on the podcast now over the last 6 months? How has it played out in these four vectors of the war, the Russian, Ukraine-NATO War of 2022. So, first up, the military war. In my earlier video, in part 1 of this retrospective on the Russian-Ukraine war, I've looked at the sort of sequence of events, the narrative of events, and also talked a little bit about some of the military issues in the war. How Russia initially, if you like, went in relatively soft, and contrary to perhaps expectations and I guess the Western mode of the war, there was no massive shock and awe campaign against Ukrainian cities in the first, not really until sort of November. And really not even yet. There has been no massive, constant bombardment of Ukrainian cities and civilian sites. It has been a very targeted set of bombing campaigns in Russia. There has been talk of brave Ukrainian resistance and Russian incompetence and so forth. And I guess always in war things don't go to plan. Plans are formulated, but they need to be adapted along the way. No plan, no war strategy survives encounter with the enemy, as they say. So it's perhaps not surprising that there was a period of change and adjustment in the first few months of the war, and that partly reflected, I guess, political constraints from Russia, as I think I discussed in the first episode. Clearly, the initial intent of the Russian military effort was not to obliterate Ukraine, but rather to force rapid negotiations, either with a new regime or with the current regime in Ukraine, around Russia's political objectives of the war. But there was always also that effort, that objective to demilitarize Ukraine, and also to prevent it being part of NATO. And in terms of territory occupied, I guess, in that first couple of months or that first month or two of the war, Russia appeared to occupy more territory of Ukraine than it currently does. So you could say that, Ukraine has pushed back the Ukrainian occupiers. But on the other hand, following the decisions in September and October, Russia has actually formally incorporated into the Russian Federation Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhia and Kherson regions. And so that large sort of crescent of east and southeast Ukraine has been lost to Russia. And I think the estimate is that somewhere in the order of 10 million, a population of roughly 10 million, and a large proportion of some of the key economic assets of Russia, of Ukraine, have now been claimed by Russia. So there's, I guess, a mixed ledger in terms of conquest, if you'd want to put it that way, at this stage of the war. And its key objectives, I guess, of the control of the territories of Lugansk and Donetsk are nearly, not quite complete from Russia's point of view, but it's certainly more effective control of those territories by Russia than there is by Ukraine. More broadly, however, I think there are a couple of key points around this conflict. First of all, this is not really a war about the control of territory. This is a war around demilitarization. This is a war to destroy an opposing army from the Russian point of view. And in that regard, they appear to be having very significant success. I mean, I'm not a military analyst. I can only make my judgments on the basis of better informed and more expert judgments around this. But there are a couple of people who I would highly trust in that. One is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who has certainly taken the view that Russia is clearly militarily winning this war. That Ukraine is now has an army of around about 150 to 200,000 soldiers, that it will be out for the first time outnumbered by the opposing Russian army, and that it's many of its logistics and command structures have effectively been destroyed, so that it is also being drawn into these fire traps in the Donbass, like Bakhmut, where strategic withdrawals by the Russian forces have led to Ukrainian soldiers coming into cities like Kherson and Bakhmut, where they are subjected to intense fire, both from a distance by Russian artillery and missiles, and up close by infantry forces, and suffering enormous casualties. And there are reports that Ukraine at this point is conscripting young boys, less than 18 years old, as well as, older men, and they're subjected to, they are provided very limited training. It is an enormous tragedy. There have been enormous casualties, and I think it's more a question of when, not if, the Ukrainian military will collapse. The second key point around this is that Russia, since no battle plan survives encounter with the enemy, the key part of winning a war has been the ability to adapt strategy to the actual facts and nature of the combat as it is. As they say, salt generals fight the last war. Smart generals work out what the current war is and adapt their strategy to that. And it would seem to me that Russia, in its new general and its reorganising of its army and forces in the last couple of months, has demonstrated the capacity to reorganise and adapt its strategy to the war. General Surovikin, and I think I've said his name right there, I'm not 100% sure. Ukraine, on the other hand, is trapped in this defence at all costs, and begging the NATO countries, particularly America, for more arms, please, every day. And it's now, I think, really just a question of time when that superior strategy and that superior organisation will, Russia will press its advantages when the moment is ripe. And in this way, I guess, it's interesting, it's a similar hypothesis that Dominic Levin makes about the War of 1812 to 1814, when Russia defeated Napoleon in Europe, despite the significant advances of France and Napoleon's empire all the way to Moscow. Russia actually adapted its strategies, understood the nature of the combat of the time, and found a way to win the war. A key part of its winning the war was its leadership and organisation. And then the third key point around the military conflict is a comment that General Bakshi, who's a former Indian general or officer, who makes comments and has just written a book on the Russia-Ukraine war, Lessons Learned, which I'll put a link to in the description below, has commented that in a way we're moving back from a doctrine of war that informed or that was informed by the American wars of the last, I guess, 50 years of Vietnam and Afghanistan, etc., where there was like a hyper-dominance of, it was an asymmetric war between a hyper-dominant power that could just, bomb Iraq or Afghanistan back into the Stone Ages, as they like to say, and where there were relatively low-intensity combats going on, to age of military combat where potentially more equally paired combatants are fighting more traditional style wars. He says, if you like, we've sort of circled back or cycled back to the nature of the conflict that was apparent in World War II. And in this way, I think Russia is showing itself to be more strategically aligned to that sort of strategy, to have got the military-industrial complex of its country organised sufficiently. It can produce all the missiles it needs, whereas the West is scrabbling around finding saying that they simply they're running out of their military stocks, and it is in the right position to win this long war of attrition. And perhaps again this is a case of how the black legend of Russian history has led Western leaders into dreadful strategic mistakes, because they've underestimated the Russian military leadership, and they've overestimated their own military strength as either the heroic resistance of Ukrainians fighting back Russian soldiers with broomsticks and rifles, or America being able to field the wonder weapons that will sort of ensure its hyper dominance in any military conflict. Okay, second dimension of the war is the economic war, and this is certainly one in which the black legend of Russian history has played a key part in the strategic miscalculations of NATO and the West. The, I guess, cliched image of Russia in American political circles is that Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. This was a comment by former Senator John McCain, Republican candidate for president against Barack Obama. And it's a comment that is repeated, I guess, by people from both sides of politics in America. And it is an assumption, I guess, that the Russian economy is sort of narrowly focused on resources, not technologically sophisticated, and all the rest of it, that has perhaps led to an overestimation of the impact of the economic sanctions on Russia. Those sanctions were extreme, and they included seizing the foreign reserves of Russia, like hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign reserves. Although apparently it seems that there were less of those foreign reserves in vulnerable positions ready to be seized than the Western countries thought there were, and that they've only been able to actually get their hands on a proportion of that estimated treasure. And similarly, there were sanctions applied against the Russian central bank, which was a serious escalation in the nature of the economic war. This was not just, criminal sanctions against bad actors. This was actually a targeting of the central, bank of Russia, help controlling its economy. The confident expectation of Joe Biden and all the rest of it was that Russia would be, the Russian ruble would become rubble before very long. In fact, the Russian ruble, certainly it went through a sudden devaluation of about 25-30%, but a whole series of measures were introduced into Russia to control outflow of money and assets, and also to diversify or to provide support for the Russian industry, and Russia's economy has displayed remarkable resilience. In fact, perhaps even more resilience than the Russian leadership expected. And this was commented on, indeed, by Vladimir Putin in his address to the Valdai Discussion Club in late October 2022, where he said that one of the surprises, including, I guess, from the more pro-Western, maybe, or what people imagine would be the more pro-Western elites within Russia, who including the governor of the Russian Reserve or Central Bank, Russia was less reliant on sympathetic attitudes of Western governments for its economy to succeed than they had thought. It had been a significant constraint on Russia's actions in Ukraine for a number of years to, try to avoid this sort of backlash from the West. When it came, Russia, it seems, was actually well prepared in a way the West was not. And Russia sort of weathered the storm. So today, I think the Russian ruble, it sort of went down a little bit in the last couple of weeks in relationship to some measures, perhaps even organised by the Russian government, but it's trading in the 70s, which is a broadly similar range to the start of the conflict. It had dropped down at its lowest point to roughly 50 cents to the US dollar. Okay, so the sanctions war failed against Russia, and if you look at the Ukrainian economy, it's lost a huge population. It's utterly dependent upon Western aid for basic operations. It's in a pathetic state. It can only really continue this war on the basis of continued propping up by Western partners. And what's more, the impact of the war on Europe particularly has been extremely negative. Gas prices have gone up, petrol prices have gone up, food prices have gone up. And some of the food price impacts of the war through both sanctions on fertilizer and, Russian trade has had a dramatically negative impact on Africa and global south, and that has had a impact on the diplomatic relationships with those countries, between the West and those diplomatic countries. So the sanctions war has been weathered by Russia, and despite I think the European Union now being on something like its 10th sanctions package against Russia, that seems to have more negative impact on the European Union than it has had on Russia. Arguably, there have been benefits for America. It is now selling a lot of oil and gas at very high prices to Europe. But there's also significant discussion of the growing de-dollarization of the world's financial system, the loss of America offering the reserve currency to the world, the reduced amount of trade in the American dollar, which underpins the high government spending on military and the significant debt in America. So, and if one of the broader consequences of this conflict is the loss of the economic and military advantages of that financial domination of the world that has underpinned American leadership really since, World War One, then that will be a dramatic loss for the NATO forces. So overall assessment is that NATO is losing the economic war against Russia. That in a way, this war is accelerating a shift to a more decentralized, multipolar economic order, not the globalized, financialized system dominated by America. Then the cultural war, and again, this is one of those, to me, truly shocking aspects of this war. I've truly been, taken aback by some of the propaganda that has dominated Western media, and also at the hostility, I guess, towards Russia. In some ways, almost, I guess, racism isn't quite the right word, but let's call it ethnic prejudice that has certainly been expressed against Russia and has been given free rein and tolerated. And also the sort of censorship, I guess, that has been applied in the West against alternative views and differing views on the Ukrainian conflict. And when I made my podcasts earlier in the year, I guess I was still serving government officials, so I was a little bit perhaps brave in saying what I did then, but I think I can be more open now to say this has really been a disgraceful episode in the history of Western media and Western political leaders. So although on the surface it would seem that the West is dominating the information war and dominating the cultural war, I do wonder whether there is at least a level of counter-offensive, so to speak, that is happening from the Russia and, if you like, the other non-Western civilizations of the world. But overall, I guess the West, with its extraordinary domination of the cultural information space through the Western media, Netflix and Google and all that sort of thing. YouTube, put on YouTube. Don't demonetize me. Well, I guess I'm not monetized yet, but they are certainly. This is one vector of the war in which the NATO powers are winning, but in winning they have perhaps overplayed their hands in whitewashing the involvement of extreme nationalism in the Ukrainian cause, in whitewashing the ethnic prejudice expressed by Ukrainian nationalist leaders, but also the American and European elites. I mean, it was Joseph Borrell who is like the foreign minister for the European Union. It's not the formal title; it's not a foreign minister, but something similar. But he said that Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. In contrast to that, I guess Vladimir Putin has explicitly, moved the debate around this aspect of this war onto a more aggressive, if you like, or taking the initiative in this debate on the war by arguing for true diversity of civilizations and like a symphony of civilizations in the world. And I think over time that cause will have growing support from the 80% of the world who are not in the West. China, India, Latin America, Africa, who will want to see more recognition for their cultural diversity and their approach to things, and less domination by the Western media. The aggressive offence of the West in the cultural war in that first few months in the war has perhaps ended up being a strategic mistake. Certainly they were able to take Russia today off air, but it has been at the price of the ultimate sabotage of their own credibility and of their own authority, and I guess the final exposure of the insularity and the assumed dominance of Western civilization over all the other traditions of the world. And I have made another video on Vladimir Putin's discussion of the symphony of civilizations that you might want to look at, as well as posting a series of videos and podcasts on the many different civilizations of the world that you also might want to check out on the YouTube channel. Finally, the diplomatic war. So in the diplomatic war, NATO, the West, Ukraine sought to isolate Russia and turn it into a pariah state, to embarrass it on the international stage, and to orchestrate votes in the United Nations and other sorts of both symbolic and real displays of disapproval from countries around the world, particularly countries that were part of the US alliance system, but also countries that were unaligned in some way or another. And there were, and some of these efforts have been quite extreme. So they've included proposals from Ukraine to exclude Russia from the United Nations Security Council. I think they've even proposed excluding Russia from the United Nations itself. which would be, I guess, something equivalent to the self-destruction of the League of Nations in the 1930s. And one of the central players in this conflict has been India, the world's, soon to be the world's largest nation. In population of India is about to overtake China in 2023, and certainly the world's largest democracy. Former imperial possession of the United Kingdom, which together with the United States has bestrode the world like a colossus for the last 300 years. And there has been enormous pressure and diplomatic efforts to try to get India to swing behind the Western or NATO American position on the Russia-Ukraine war. Relatively early on in the conflict, a Quad meeting was held in my own, Quad being the quadrilateral security dialogue meeting between the United States of America, Japan, Australia and India, which has been a significant effort to try to draw India more explicitly from its long tradition of non-alignment into a aligned position on the Indo-Pacific strategy, the containment of China, alongside those Anglophone states of America, England, AUKUS, I'm thinking of AUKUS, the Anglophone states, but America, Australia and Japan, which still, I guess, is, if you like, an occupied country by America with a sort of constrained constitution following World War II. And the Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, was in Melbourne, and the Australian media badgered him about why he would not sort of support the American position on and oppose Russia more explicitly, whereas India's always maintained a relatively balanced position in support of the resolution through conflict and dialogue, but they've also refused to go along with the Western sanctions and oil price caps and restrictions on the sale of military equipment and so on. And there was even a meeting, a special leaders summit organised with at some point where Joe Biden sought to pressure Narendra Modi as Prime Minister of India to sort of, fall into line with the American position. But they have consistently failed to achieve that. India has continued to maintain its its position on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, has refused to be drawn into sort of bloc politics, and has attracted a growing number of the BRICS nations. And what's also been apparent throughout 2022 is, despite all the American efforts to bully the world, I guess, into its economic war against Russia, the various BRICS nations, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, Latin America, have been increasingly asserting themselves in support of the new emerging institutions like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and also in support of a fairer multipolar world order. Indeed, I think there was a major vote at the United Nations General Assembly at some point where the great majority of the world expressed its support for a fairer world order rather than the sort of American liberal rules-based order. And that has only strengthened, including Saudi Arabia growing much closer to China, potentially joining BRICS, and multiple major commodity nations, including Saudi Arabia, moving to trade in their own currencies rather than through the US dollar for oil, which is both a military, economic and diplomatic defeat for the NATO partners. And so all the efforts to isolate Russia and to separate out the great states of India and China from their support for Russia have, I think, ultimately been unsuccessful through 2022. And perhaps this has culminated most dramatically in the sort of all-day video conference meeting between Xi Jinping of China and Vladimir Putin of Russia on the 30th of December. And as you can see here, both China and Russia have released their sort of media releases on those talks. And let me just read two key sections from each of the readouts of those sections, which relate to this whole question of, well, who is winning the diplomatic war provoked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it says here that President Xi, this is from the Chinese readout, President Xi emphasized that the world has now come to another historical crossroads. To revert to a Cold War mentality, provoke division and antagonism, and stoke confrontation between blocs, or to act out of the common good that's on the one side, or to act out of the common good of humanity to promote equality, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. The tug of war between these two trends is testing the wisdom of statesmen in major countries, as well as the reason of the entire humanity. Facts have repeatedly proven that containment and suppression, which I'll just insert, you could take as code for American attempts to contain China, to contain Russia, is unpopular, and sanction and interference is doomed to fail, as indeed we have learned in looking at the economic war against Russia. China stands ready to join hands with Russia and all other progressive forces around the world who oppose hegemony and power politics, to reject any unilateralism, protectionism, and bullying, firmly safeguard the sovereignty, security, and development interests of the two countries, and uphold international fairness and justice. The two sides need to maintain close coordination and collaboration in international affairs, uphold the authority of the United Nations and the status of international law, stand for true multilateralism, and fulfill their responsibilities as major countries, and lead by example on such issues as protecting the global food and energy security, i.e. not sanctioning fertilizer and oil and gas. The two sides need to continue encouraging parties of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to enhance solidarity and mutual trust, show greater mutual support on issues concerning one another's core interests, and jointly resist interference and sabotage by external forces, i.e. United States colour revolutions and geostrategic games. BRICS cooperation has seen multiple highlights, which speaks volumes about the appeal and bright prospects of BRICS. China will work with Russia to actively advance BRICS membership expansion to bolster the strength of BRICS countries and uphold the common interests of emerging market countries and developing countries. And then a little bit further on, there is also a brief paragraph saying that the two presidents exchanged views on the Ukraine crisis. President Xi stressed that China has noted Russia's statement that it has never refused to resolve the conflict through diplomatic negotiations, and China commends that. The path of peace talks will not be a smooth one, but as long as parties do not give up, there will always be prospects for peace. China will continue to hold an objective and impartial position, work to build synergy in the international community, and play a constructive role toward a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine crisis. So China is got Russia's back, so to speak, and it has not deviated at all from the position it has articulated throughout the process, and in fact is very much talking about strengthening BRICS and strengthening a fairer multipolar world order. Then if we look at the Russian statement, so in the Russian president's readout of the statement, which relate to his remarks, I guess, at the start of the video conference before the meeting became a closed one, he says, in the context of growing geopolitical tensions, the importance of the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership as a stability factor is growing. Our relations have passed all the tests, demonstrating their maturity and stability, and they continue to grow dynamically. As both of us pointed out, our current relations are enjoying the best period in their history and can be regarded as a model of cooperation between major powers in the 21st century. Geostrategic ideas from America to split Russia and China have clearly failed. He then goes on to comment that that intensive bilateral exchanges will continue in the coming year. I have no doubt that we will find an opportunity to meet in person. We are expecting you next spring with a state visit to Moscow, so that would be, I guess, in the sort of March, April time. Perhaps even after Russia has finally defeated Ukraine on the battlefields of the Donbass. This will demonstrate to the whole world how strong the Russian-Chinese friendship is. Our agreement on key issues. Your visit will become the main political event of the year in bilateral relations. Despite the unfavourable external situation, the illegitimate restrictions and patent blackmail on the part of certain Western countries, Russia and China have achieved record high growth rates in mutual trade. In 2022, it increased by about 25%. If this trend continues, we will be able to achieve the target of 200 billion set by 2040 2024 ahead of schedule. The economic war against Russia is failing. So it seems on the diplomatic war front that the global rules-based order has lost all credibility with the global south, that India has kept its non-aligned position, and in fact perhaps become growingly disenchanted with American and European efforts and British efforts to strong arm it into an anti-Russian position, and that the Russia-China strategic partnership is stronger than ever. And indeed, both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are planning on a visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow in the March, April, May period, perhaps after a successful winter offensive in Ukraine, perhaps after the final collapse of the Zelensky regime and the NATO war against Russia in Ukraine, and that BRICS is growing stronger, and the institutions of a new multipolar world are starting to emerge. So on 3 out of 4 fronts, it seems Russia is winning the war against NATO. It's winning on the military battlefields. It's winning through its superior resilience on the economic front, turning to its partner in China that Europe and America want to turn into a ideological competitor, and it's winning on the diplomatic front, finding growing support and leadership for the focus on international law-based system and true multilateralism through BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and perhaps a reformed UN Security Council, which will have fewer American and European powers and more, potentially even include India in the not too distant future. And on the cultural war front, the one front where Russia is weakest, the information war, the West and NATO has perhaps overplayed its hand and compromised its own cultural values in instigating an astonishing and intolerant campaign to cancel Russia. So that's where I see things against those 4 fronts. And so then the question then becomes, how do we understand this war in a broader historical context? Is it Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine? Is it war provoked by NATO expansion eastwards? Or is it an even broader war, the end of the long 100 years Cold War of the Anglo-American powers against Russia, or the beginning of global wars of independence? And that broader narrative framing is going to be the topic of the 3rd video I'm going to do on this issue, this theme. But that will come out in approximately a week's or two's time after a brief visit by myself to the beaches of southern Australia. I hope you've enjoyed this. Do subscribe, do like, leave us a comment in the comments below. I'd be really interested in your own views on the interpretation of this war, and I might reflect some of those back in my third segment of the episode on how can we reframe the Russia-Ukraine-NATO war in a broader historical context. More from me soon.